My husband's family hijacked our honeymoon, and then told me I wasn't invited. We were married for less than 24 hours when my husband told me the news. His family was coming with us to Bali. Oh, and me? I was expected to stay home and prove myself as a wife. That's when I realized I didn't marry a man. I married a mama's boy. So while they flew off to Bali, I booked my own trip to Hawaii alone. By the time they got back, I had made my decision. I wasn't his wife anymore. Growing up, I was always the dutiful daughter, the eldest in a traditional family. I carried the invisible weight of expectations on my shoulders from as far back as I could remember. My parents were strict but loving, the type who would tell you they pushed you because they wanted you to succeed. And succeed I did, or at least that's how it seemed on the outside. I graduated college at the top of my class, landed a great job in finance, and built a life that my parents could proudly boast about to their friends. Yet somewhere in the process I lost sight of who I really was. I became the person everyone else needed me to be, constantly bending to meet the demands and expectations placed on me. 2 years ago I met James. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Charming, attentive, and incredibly supportive, or at least that's what I thought at the time. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party, and from the moment our eyes met, I felt a spark. James had a way of making people feel special, like you were the only person in the room who mattered. It wasn't long before we were spending all our free time together, sharing dreams of the future and planning a life that seemed perfect in every way. One thing that drew me to James was how much he valued family. He spoke about his parents and siblings with such reverence, painting them as the ideal close-knit family. Coming from a small family myself, where the bonds were strong but private, I admired his devotion to his loved ones. I thought it was endearing, even enviable. But as time went on, I began to see that his family wasn't just close-knit, they were overbearing, and their involvement in his life bordered on control. At first, I didn't mind the occasional family dinner or the fact that James would drop plans with me to help his parents or siblings. I convinced myself it was sweet, a testament to his character. But over time I started to notice a pattern. James didn't just prioritize his family, he lived for them. Every decision, big or small, seemed to require their input. If his parents needed help with something, it didn't matter what James and I had planned. He'd cancel without a second thought. Weekend getaways were rescheduled, date nights were interrupted, and even minor arguments between his siblings would consume his attention until they were resolved. It wasn't just about being a loving son or brother, it was as if James was incapable of saying no to them. Despite these red flags, I stayed. I loved James, and I wanted to believe that once we got married, things would naturally fall into place. I thought that once we started our own family, he'd learn to prioritize us over the constant demands of his parents and siblings. It was naive, I know, but love has a way of clouding your judgment. The wedding planning process should have been a joyful experience, but it quickly became a source of stress and frustration. James's family inserted themselves into every decision, from the guest list to the venue to the flowers. My vision for an intimate, personal ceremony was quickly overshadowed by their grandiose ideas and relentless demands. At one point, James's mother, Patricia, insisted that we invite several distant relatives I'd never even met because, as she put it, family comes first. I should have seen the writing on the wall then, but I ignored it. I convinced myself that the wedding was just one day, and that what really mattered was the life James and I would build together afterward. I swallowed my pride and let his family have their way, determined not to let their overreach ruin what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The wedding itself was beautiful on the surface. The venue was stunning, the food was exquisite, and everyone commented on how perfect everything looked. But for me it felt like a performance. It wasn't a celebration of our love. It was a production orchestrated by James's family, with me playing the role of the compliant bride. Patricia spent the entire day barking orders at the wedding planner, and James's sister Nicole critiqued every aspect of my dress, hair, and makeup as if it were her place to do so. By the time James and I shared our first dance, I was emotionally drained. But I told myself it was worth it because we were finally married, and surely things would get better from here. The morning after the wedding, I woke up feeling a mix of exhaustion and excitement. James and I were scheduled to leave for our honeymoon that afternoon, a 2-week trip to Bali. It had been a compromise. I had always dreamed of exploring Europe, but James insisted on Bali, claiming it was more exotic and romantic. He had mentioned that his family had been there before and had recommended it highly. Reluctantly, I agreed, figuring it was a small concession in the grand scheme of things. As I finished packing, James approached me with a strange look on his face. He said we needed to talk, and I immediately felt a pang of anxiety. His tone was too serious for what should have been a carefree morning. We sat down in the living room, and that's when he dropped the bombshell. "My family is coming with us on the honeymoon," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It's going to be more of a family vacation." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. He went on to explain that his parents, siblings, and even a few cousins had decided to join us. And then came the real kicker. "They think it's best if you stay behind." For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. Surely he couldn't mean that I, his new wife, wasn't welcome on our honeymoon. But as he continued to speak, it became clear that he was serious. His family expected me to stay home and take care of the house, while they enjoyed the trip we had planned together. James smiled as if he thought I'd be thrilled by this idea. As if staying home to do chores while my husband vacationed with his family was some great honor. I was stunned, angry, and heartbroken all at once. But more than that, I was done. This wasn't just about the honeymoon. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been present throughout our entire relationship. If I accepted this, I would be setting the precedent for a lifetime of being disrespected and sidelined. I sat there, frozen on the couch, as James continued to talk. He went on about how this would be a great opportunity for me to prove myself to his family, to show them how committed I was to being a part of their unit. His words blurred together, each one more absurd than the last. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. A great opportunity? To prove myself? By staying home to cook, clean, and take care of things while my husband and his family enjoyed the honeymoon trip we'd planned together? The room felt like it was spinning. My mind raced back to all the sacrifices I'd made in the past 2 years, all the times I'd bent over backward to accommodate James and his family, all the moments I'd brushed aside my own feelings to keep the peace. And now this. The weight of it all hit me like a ton of bricks. How had I let it get this far? But as much as I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and forced a smile. "I understand," I said softly, though my heart was breaking. "If this is what your family wants, I won't stand in the way." James looked relieved, even pleased. He kissed my forehead and thanked me for being so understanding. Then he excused himself to finish packing, leaving me alone in the living room. As soon as he was out of sight, the tears I had been holding back began to fall. I couldn't believe the man I had married just days ago thought so little of me, that he could so easily cast me aside to appease his overbearing family. But amidst the heartbreak, a new emotion began to take root. Anger. Not the kind of fiery, uncontrollable rage that makes you lash out, but a quiet, simmering anger that sparks clarity and resolve. I realized in that moment that I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let James and his family walk all over me, treating me like an afterthought in my own life. If I didn't stand up for myself now, when would I? I retreated to the bedroom and closed the door, needing some space to think. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase I had packed for Bali. My clothes, neatly folded and ready for what was supposed to be the start of my married life, now felt like a cruel joke. The honeymoon I'd been so excited for was no longer mine. It had been hijacked by people who didn't value me, who didn't see me as an equal, let alone as James's partner. As I sat there, a plan began to form. I thought about where I could go, what I could do to reclaim this time for myself. My mind wandered to my parents' vacation home in Hawaii, a place that had always been a source of comfort and peace. They had initially offered it to us for our honeymoon, but James had insisted on Bali, dismissing Hawaii as too ordinary. Now it seemed like the perfect escape. Without wasting any time, I grabbed my phone and booked a last-minute flight to Maui. It was impulsive, maybe even reckless, but I didn't care. I needed to get away, to clear my head and figure out what to do next. Staying home to play the role James's family had assigned me was not an option. Before leaving, I wrote a short note to James. I kept it brief, not wanting to give him or his family the satisfaction of knowing how deeply they had hurt me. "Since you'll be enjoying Bali with your family," I wrote, "I thought I'd take some time for myself as well. We can talk when we're both back." I placed the note on the kitchen counter, grabbed my suitcase and walked out the door without looking back. The drive to the airport felt surreal. I kept waiting for the guilt to set in, for that familiar voice in my head to tell me I was overreacting, that I should turn around and do what James wanted. But it never came. Instead, I felt a growing sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was putting myself first, and it felt liberating. I arrived in Maui late that night, greeted by the sound of waves crashing against the shore and the warm, salty breeze of the ocean. My parents' vacation home was just as I remembered it, cozy and inviting, with large windows that offered breathtaking views of the sea. I dropped my bags in the bedroom and stood by the window, watching the moonlight dance on the water. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. This was exactly where I needed to be. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, filling the room with a warm golden glow. I stretched, feeling more rested than I had in weeks. I decided that this trip would be about me. Not about James, not about his family, but about rediscovering who I was and what I wanted. Over the next few days, I allowed myself to indulge in simple pleasures. I treated myself to spa days, explored the local shops, and savored every bite of the delicious food Hawaii had to offer. I signed up for surfing lessons, something I'd always wanted to try but had never gotten around to. Each day I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. But as much as I tried to focus on the present, my mind kept drifting back to James and our relationship. I thought about all the times I had compromised, all the times I had put his needs and his family's needs above my own. I realized that I had been so desperate for their approval that I had lost sight of my own worth. And now I was paying the price. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I came to a decision. I deserved better. I deserved a partner who respected me, who valued my feelings and saw me as an equal. If James couldn't be that partner, if he couldn't stand up to his family and prioritize our marriage, then I was better off without him. With that realization came a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my life. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to settle for less than I deserved. When my time in Hawaii came to an end, I packed my bags and headed back home, ready to confront James and his family. I wasn't sure how they would react, but I knew I was strong enough to handle whatever came next. Landing back home felt surreal. The peaceful 2 weeks in Hawaii had been a much-needed escape, but now I was stepping back into the reality I had left behind. I turned on my phone as soon as I exited the plane, and the deluge of notifications was immediate. Missed calls, voicemails, and texts, most of them from James and his family. My heart sank as I scrolled through the messages. What I saw only confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't just about the honeymoon, it was about control. James's first few texts were mild, confused, even. "Where are you? And we need to talk." But as the days had gone on, the messages grew more hostile. He accused me of abandoning him, of ruining our marriage. His mother's texts were worse. She called me selfish and disrespectful, accusing me of shaming their family name. My sister-in-law joined in, hurling insults about my upbringing and my failure to fit into their family traditions. The worst were the voicemails. James's voice was a mixture of frustration and desperation. In one message, he scolded me for being immature and not fulfilling my responsibilities as his wife. In another, he demanded I apologize to his family, claiming they were willing to forgive me if I showed some humility. I almost laughed out loud when I heard that one. Forgive me? For what? For daring to stand up for myself? His family's entitlement was astonishing, but it also solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about a honeymoon or a family squabble. It was about a fundamental lack of respect for me as an individual, as a partner, as someone who mattered. I had spent the past 2 years bending over backward to make things work with James and his family, sacrificing my own needs and desires in the process. And what had it gotten me? A husband who thought it was acceptable to leave me behind so his family could enjoy my honeymoon. When I arrived at my friend's house, I felt a wave of relief. She had been my rock throughout this ordeal, offering me a place to stay when I wasn't ready to face my parents or return to my marital home. She greeted me with a warm hug, and we spent the evening talking about my trip and what I planned to do next. "I can't go back to him," I admitted, my voice trembling. "This isn't just a one-time thing. This is who he is, who his family is, If I go back, I'm signing up for a lifetime of this. My friend nodded, her expression serious. You deserve better. You've always deserved better. Don't let them make you doubt that. Her words gave me strength, but the next few days were anything but easy. James's calls and texts didn't stop. His family, emboldened by his silence, began harassing my parents. My mom called me one evening, her voice shaking as she recounted how James's mother and sister had shown up at their house, demanding to know where I was. They accused my parents of raising a disrespectful daughter and implied that my behavior was a reflection of their poor parenting. I was furious. It was one thing for them to attack me, but dragging my parents into this was crossing a line. I reassured my mom that she didn't need to engage with them and told her to block their numbers. If they show up again, I said firmly, call the police. The next day I decided to call James. I couldn't avoid this confrontation any longer. When he picked up, his tone was cold. So you're finally ready to talk? James, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. This marriage isn't working. There was a pause and then he scoffed. You're overreacting. It was just a misunderstanding. My family was trying to include you and you blew it out of proportion. If you just come back and apologize, we could move past this. My jaw clenched. Include me? By leaving me behind on my own honeymoon? By expecting me to stay home and do chores while you all went to Bali? That's not inclusion, James. That's control. He sighed, exasperated. You don't understand. That's just how my family is. They're traditional. They expect certain things and I can't just change that overnight. And what about what I expect? I shot back. What about my needs? My feelings? Or do they not matter because I don't fit into your family's version of tradition? James was silent for a moment and I thought maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand. But then he spoke again, and his words shattered any hope I had left. You're being selfish. Marriage is about compromise. If you can't handle being part of my family, then maybe you're not cut out for this. The anger that had been simmering inside me boiled over. You're right, I said, my voice cold. I'm not cut out for this. I'm not cut out to be treated like a second-class citizen in my own marriage. I'm done, James. I'm filing for divorce. He didn't say anything, but I could hear his breathing on the other end of the line, heavy and uneven. Finally, he muttered, "You'll regret this," before hanging up. When the call ended, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the love I thought we had, for the future I had envisioned with James. But relief because I knew I was finally standing up for myself, finally putting my own happiness first. Over the next few days, I began making arrangements to move forward with the divorce. I contacted a lawyer, who assured me that the process would be straightforward given how short our marriage had been. I also informed my parents about my decision, and they were nothing but supportive. My mom hugged me tightly and said, "We just want you to be happy, sweetheart. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're not worth fighting for." As I started to rebuild my life, I received an unexpected message from a stranger, James's ex-girlfriend. She had heard about my situation through mutual friends and wanted to share her own experience with James and his family. Her story was eerily similar to mine, from the overbearing in-laws to the constant expectation that she prioritized their needs over her own. Hearing her perspective was both validating and heartbreaking. It made me realize that this wasn't just a one-time thing, it was a pattern. James's family had always been like this, and they always would be. Her words gave me the final push I needed to fully let go of any lingering doubts. I deserved better than James and his toxic family dynamics. And while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew I was strong enough to walk it. The decision to file for divorce felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But I knew it wasn't the end of the battle. James and his family weren't the type to take rejection lightly, and their reaction to my decision only proved me right. The day after I told James my intentions, I woke up to a series of furious texts from him, his mother, and even his sister. They ranged from desperate pleas to outright accusations. James's messages alternated between attempts at guilt-tripping me and thinly veiled threats. "You're destroying everything we built," one text read. Another said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. No one else will ever put up with you like I did." The words stung, but they also reinforced my decision. If this was how he reacted to me standing up for myself, then there was nothing left worth saving. His mother, Evelyn, was even worse. She accused me of being a disgraceful wife and claimed I had brought shame to their family. Her texts were filled with insults, calling me selfish, ungrateful, and disrespectful. She even went as far as to suggest that I had manipulated James into marrying me, only to abandon him. It was absurd but also exhausting. Every time I thought they couldn't stoop lower, they found a way to surprise me. Despite their relentless attacks, I stayed firm. I didn't respond to their messages or answer their calls. My lawyer advised me to document everything, just in case things escalated further, so I took screenshots of every text and saved every voicemail. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me into backing down. As I started preparing for the legal process, my parents became my greatest support system. My mom, who had been devastated by how James's family had treated me, was constantly by my side, helping me navigate the logistics of moving forward. My dad, usually a reserved and calm man, was visibly angry every time he heard about another stunt James's family pulled. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room discussing the next steps, my dad said something that stayed with me. "You're stronger than they think you are," he told me, his voice steady. "They're trying to break you because they think you'll fold under pressure. But you won't. You're our daughter, and you've got more resilience than they'll ever understand." His words gave me strength. For so long I had doubted myself, thinking I wasn't strong enough to stand up to James and his family. But now I realized that I had been strong all along. It took strength to walk away from a toxic situation, to prioritize my own well-being, and to demand the respect I deserved. As the days went on, I started to rebuild my life piece by piece. I focused on my work, spending long hours at the office to keep my mind occupied. My coworkers, who had always been kind and supportive, rallied around me when they heard about what I was going through. One of them even suggested a weekend getaway to clear my head, and while I wasn't ready to take another trip just yet, the offer reminded me that I had people in my corner. But just as I was beginning to find my footing, James escalated things yet again. One evening, as I was leaving work, I noticed a familiar figure leaning against my car in the parking lot. My heart sank as I realized it was James. I hadn't told him where I was staying, so he must have gone out of his way to track me down. The sight of him filled me with equal parts anger and fear, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone unusually subdued. I crossed my arms, keeping a safe distance. "There's nothing left to talk about, James. I've made my decision." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't understand why you're doing this. We're supposed to be a team. You're my wife." His words might have sounded heartfelt to someone who didn't know better, but I could see through the facade. This wasn't about love or partnership. It was about control. James didn't want to lose me because it would mean losing the image of a perfect marriage that he and his family were so desperate to maintain. "I was your wife," I replied, my voice steady. "But you and your family made it very clear that I was never going to be a priority. I'm not willing to spend the rest of my life being treated like an outsider in my own marriage." James's expression darkened. "You're overreacting. My family isn't perfect, but they mean well. You just need to try harder to get along with them." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Try harder? I gave everything I had to make things work with them, and it was never enough. They didn't want a daughter-in-law, James. They wanted a servant. And you let them treat me that way. For a moment, James looked like he might argue, but then he simply shook his head. "You're making a mistake," he muttered before walking away. As I watched him leave, I felt a strange sense of closure. It was clear that James wasn't going to change. He would always prioritize his family's expectations over my needs, and I deserved better than that. I deserved a partner who respected me, valued me, and stood by me no matter what. The next day, I finalized the paperwork with my lawyer. It was a bittersweet moment, but mostly it felt like freedom. I was finally taking control of my life, breaking free from the toxic cycle that had consumed me for far too long. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Divorce, even in the best circumstances, is never simple. But I also knew that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I had faced James and his family head-on, and I had come out the other side. Now it was time to focus on myself, to rebuild my life on my own terms. As I left the lawyer's office, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe deeply and take in the world around me. The sun was shining, and the air felt crisp and fresh. It was a new day, and I was ready to embrace it. The days after filing the divorce papers were a whirlwind of emotions. There were moments of relief and pride for taking control of my life, but there were also moments of deep sadness. Despite everything, I had loved James once, and it was hard to reconcile the man I had fallen for with the person who had treated me so poorly. It felt like mourning the loss of a dream, our future together, the life we had planned, and the person I thought he was. Living with my parents brought me a sense of comfort and safety I hadn't felt in a long time. My mom always seemed to know when I needed her, whether it was a warm hug, a cup of tea, or just her quiet presence. My dad, while not as vocal about his feelings, showed his support in the little things, fixing up my old room to make it feel like home, surprising me with my favorite snacks, and even offering to drive me to work so I didn't have to face the commute alone. They were a reminder of what unconditional love looked like, and I clung to that as I tried to heal. However, James and his family weren't ready to let go so easily. The voicemails and texts didn't stop. James's tone shifted from pleading to threatening, and back again in a maddening cycle. His mother, Evelyn, continued her campaign of defamation, telling anyone who would listen that I was a selfish, ungrateful woman who had abandoned her husband. She even went as far as to spread lies that I had stolen money from James or that I was cheating on him. It was infuriating and exhausting, but I refused to engage. One day while I was at work, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was calm but serious as she said, "Honey, Evelyn showed up at the house today." I froze. "What? What did she want?" "She demanded to see you. She was yelling about how you've ruined her family and destroyed her son's life. She tried to push her way inside, but your dad and I stood our ground. We told her to leave or we'd call the police. Eventually, she left, but not before making a scene in front of the neighbors." The knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't believe Evelyn would stoop so low, but at the same time I wasn't entirely surprised. This was exactly the kind of behavior I had come to expect from her. Manipulative, invasive, and completely lacking in boundaries. "That's it," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "I'm filing for a restraining order." When I got home that evening, I sat down with my parents and explained my decision. They were fully supportive, and my dad even offered to accompany me to the lawyer's office. My lawyer agreed that a restraining order was a necessary step, given Evelyn's escalating behavior. The paperwork was filed the next day, and I felt a sense of relief knowing that I was taking steps to protect myself and my family. As I waited for the restraining order to be processed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. Work became a refuge, a place where I could focus on something other than the chaos surrounding my personal life. My boss and coworkers were incredibly understanding, giving me the space and support I needed to navigate this challenging time. Outside of work, I started reconnecting with old friends and hobbies. I realized how much of myself I had lost during my relationship with James. I had stopped painting, a passion I'd once loved, and I hadn't gone on a hike in years, something I used to do regularly to clear my mind. Slowly, I began to rediscover these parts of myself, and it felt like reclaiming pieces of my identity that I had forgotten existed. One weekend, I decided to attend a local art class that a friend had recommended. It was a small group of people, all there to explore their creativity and learn new techniques. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace as I let the colors flow across the canvas. The instructor, an older woman with a warm smile, came by to admire my work. "You have a natural talent," she said, her voice kind. "Have you been painting for long?" I smiled, a little embarrassed. "Not as much as I'd like to. Life got in the way." She nodded knowingly. "Well, you're here now. That's what matters." Her words stuck with me. I realized that it was okay to have setbacks, to lose yourself for a while as long as you found your way back. I wasn't just moving on from James. I was rediscovering who I was and what made me happy. But just as I started to find my rhythm, James's family struck again. This time it was through social media. Evelyn and James's sister began posting cryptic messages about betrayal, selfishness, and the importance of family. While they didn't mention me by name, it was obvious who they were referring to. Mutual friends began reaching out, asking what was going on and if I was okay. I debated whether to address the situation publicly or to stay silent. Ultimately, I decided that I didn't owe them any explanations. I wasn't going to engage in their childish games or stoop to their level. Instead, I focused on documenting everything as evidence for the restraining order. Every post, every comment, every message, I saved it all. A few days later, the restraining order was granted. Evelyn and James were legally prohibited from contacting me or coming near me or my family. It was a huge relief, but I knew it wouldn't magically erase the pain they had caused. Healing would take time, and I was prepared to take it one step at a time. Despite everything, I felt a sense of hope. I had survived the worst of it, and I was finally taking control of my own narrative. My future was mine to shape, and I was determined to fill it with love, joy, and peace on my own terms. With the restraining order in place, the storm that James and his family had stirred up began to quiet down. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Evelyn's dramatic outbursts, James's pleading messages, and the passive-aggressive social media posts ceased almost overnight. The legal boundary had done what months of my patience and attempts at reason could not. It forced them to stay away. As the days turned into weeks, I focused on reclaiming my life. My parents were a constant source of support, reminding me every day that I was stronger than the chaos I'd endured. My dad, in particular, made it his mission to cheer me up in small but meaningful ways. One evening, he surprised me with a new set of art supplies, saying, "If painting makes you happy, then you should never stop." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I hugged him tightly, grateful for the unwavering love of my family. I continued attending the art class, where I started forming new friendships with people who shared my passion for creativity. These connections felt refreshing and genuine, a stark contrast to the draining relationships I'd endured with James and his family. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. The divorce process moved along relatively smoothly after James signed the papers. He made a few half-hearted attempts to reach out through our lawyer, asking for another chance or proposing compromises, but I stood firm. I didn't want or need anything from him anymore. Not his explanations, his apologies, or his promises to change. I had given him enough chances, and it was clear that he would never truly prioritize me or our marriage. As the finalization of the divorce drew closer, I realized just how much I had learned from this experience. For so long, I had lived as a people pleaser, bending over backward to meet others' expectations while ignoring my own needs. I had allowed myself to be swept up in a relationship that, in hindsight, had always been one-sided. But now I was learning to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, and to recognize my own worth. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was one I was proud to be on. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch with my mom, watching the sunset, she turned to me and said, "You know, honey, this whole situation may have been painful, but I think it was a blessing in disguise. It showed you what you don't want in a partner, and taught you to never settle for less than you deserve." Her words resonated deeply. She was right. This experience, as difficult as it had been, had given me clarity about what I wanted and needed in life. I didn't just want a partner who loved me. I wanted a partner who respected me, valued me, and treated me as an equal. And I knew now that I wouldn't settle for anything less. The day the divorce was finalized, I felt a wave of emotions: relief, closure, and even a touch of sadness for what could have been. But above all, I felt free. Free from the toxic dynamics that had held me back, free from the weight of trying to please people who would never be satisfied, and free to create a future that was entirely my own. To celebrate this new chapter, my parents surprised me with a trip back to Hawaii. This time, it wasn't an escape but a celebration of resilience and new beginnings. As I stood on the beach watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had come full circle, returning to the place where I had first reclaimed my independence, but now I was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. Looking back, I realized that James and his family had taught me some of the most valuable lessons of my life, not because of what they gave me, but because of what they showed me I deserved. Their actions had pushed me to the brink, but they had also forced me to stand up for myself in a way I never had before. As I packed up my things at the end of the trip and prepared to return home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward. My future was mine to create, and for the first time in a long time, I felt excited about what lay ahead. I knew there would still be challenges. Life is rarely smooth sailing. But I also knew that I was strong enough to face them. I had survived heartbreak, betrayal, and the weight of unrealistic expectations, and I had come out on the other side stronger than ever. As the plane took off, I looked out the window and whispered a quiet goodbye to the past. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first arrived in Hawaii, and for that I was grateful. I was ready to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that no matter what came my way, I would always have the strength to rise above it. The chapter with James and his family was officially closed, and a new one was beginning. And this time it was all about me.